Hail thee well, and welcome all. I'm the Jake of all trades, and this is episode 4 of my Dungeon Master Masterclass. Last episode we were creating some adventures that you can use in your new role-playing game that you've just started, and today I'm going to tell you how you can start your game. I'm going to show you how to start your game, the things that you need to go over before you start your game, and the things you should talk to your players about before they begin playing your game as well. Before we get started, while I was preparing this video, I realized there was a few things in my session zero video that I should have gone over with you guys as well. I didn't talk to you about player associations. You should talk to your players and ask them if they know each other before the game starts. Try to get at least one or two of the people to know each other before your game begins. Maybe they're siblings, maybe they're related in some other way, maybe they're just really close friends, maybe they belong to a guild or something, a local guild in your world. That's up to your world and up to you, but you should try to get your players involved with each other during the creation process of their characters. And that goes into the other thing I wanted to talk about, which was player backstories. Before you begin session 1, or as you're writing your notes up for session 1, you should have an idea, a pretty good idea of all of your players' backstories, or at least the kinds of characters that they are going to be playing. This is going to be incredibly beneficial to you when you are writing up your adventure and creating encounters for them to overcome. Now that that's out of the way, we can get started, and the first thing that we need to go over is how you are going to be taking your notes, or some ideas for how you can take your notes at the least. I'm not going to say that this is the way to do it. This is only the way that I do it. After years of playing and GMing and stuff, this is the formula, or the sort of a system, loosely, of what my notes look like. And there's a difference between a railroad and a sandbox. I've done both games. Both are awesome. But they do end up being a little bit different when you are writing up the character sheets. The railroad notes end up being a little more rigid and a little more like a timeline, with each encounter leading to another encounter and events leading to each other, with maybe gaps in between those encounters for your players to get involved with the world as well. But the sandbox, by comparison, and I'm going to be showing some examples here too, the sandbox, by comparison, is much more loose, and minimal effort is necessary to create a session in a sandbox game. That's up to the players, what they want to do, and so to prompt them, you really only need to focus on locations and stuff, which is why you can see that instead of having encounter number 1, 2, and 3, I have locations 1, 2, and 3. And the map at the bottom of the railroad notes is actually, that's a map, that's a section for a map for like an encounter, like a bandit camp or something like that. But the map location for the sandbox notes you see is for a location. That's just like a local shop or a business, or maybe just a rough outline of the city if you're bored. I don't know. But anyway, so that's the thing. Notes are a little different depending on what kind of game you're running, but you'll see that a lot of the other stuff looks pretty much the same. I still have the session number. I still have like location details. I'm trying to talk about the location, and a lot of the stuff that I talk about at the beginning of the game is also the same too. The opening notes, where I recap what's going on with the players, or the players recap to me, as I typically prefer it. And then I fill them in on what they're doing, and where they should be headed, and that sort of thing, based on the quests that they're doing. The next thing that you might have noticed about those notes is that the day count was also still present. I had days past on one, and then the present day on the other one, but it's still essentially the same concept. I'm keeping track of the amount of time that has passed within my game since the players have started playing, essentially. And I would encourage you to do this as well if you are running a game. It's very, very cool, and the earlier you do it, the better. It's much more difficult. In my first game, my Avatar game, I didn't actually start tracking time until the 6th or 7th session of the game, I believe, and that was when I realized that I needed to start keeping track of the time, and then I had to retroactively go back and try to figure out exactly how much time my players had spent in different regions of the map. The reason I would encourage you to track time, and I say this because it is incredibly rewarding for your players, and for you in a sense as well as the game master, but more so for your players, I think. It's really cool to be, have your game master be like, oh yeah, you guys have been traveling together now for like, 3.5 months or something, and then the players get to take a step back and think about it, like, whoa, we've been out here adventuring for like 3.5 months, and they start to feel like they've earned these levels instead of them just being given to them. They feel like they are actually becoming stronger, and that they are being hardened by their adventures in the wilderness and all of these quests that they're doing, all of these dangerous missions. So it's incredibly rewarding for your players to have an idea of how much time has gone by as well, and it can help them with their role playing as too. It can help remind your players that maybe their characters might be softening up if they're more of a hard nut kind of guy, or they might be be having more personal conversations with members of the party, because it's like, hey, we've been traveling together for a while now, and I don't really know much about you, like where you come from or anything about your family life. Those are things that your players can think about while they're hearing how much time has passed in game. And honestly, it's not super hard if you sit down and just, if you just focus on it and you try to remember to do it every session. Maybe when you're awarding XP, you try to do a mental count of how many days have passed and then chart it down. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel and come up with an entirely new calendar. You can just use the same calendar that, that your players are familiar with, because that's going to be easier for you guys anyway. And it's the same general effect. It's the same reason why we speak in our native language when we're playing the game, and we don't try to speak in Elvish or Dwarvish when we are actually speaking those languages, obviously, because we don't know those languages. And it's hard. If you're going to create a new calendar, then you have to learn that entire new calendar, even if it's really cool and it's centered around your world, and it helps. It's engaging in that way. It helps add another layer of depth to your world. But on the other side of that coin, it's another chore for your players, to have to track, like, wait, what friggin' month is it again? Was it Morndas or Tuesdas? I don't know. And that's another thing. You could go with the Skyrim days, because it's pretty easy, pretty nice transition. Or you could create your own days of the week that were similar to our days, so that it was easier for you to track time. Those are just some general ideas, but I'm just going straight September, October, November, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in my game that I'm running currently, and I think it works just fine. Well, that covers note-taking. Now we can get to the adventure part of this session, which is actually going to be probably the shortest part of this video, because I don't have a lot to say on your adventure, actually. In our last videos, my last two videos, I showed you how to create your own adventure using a random adventure generator, and I think that that's going to be pretty useful, and I think that I had a pretty decent walkthrough of how to use it, and I think it works pretty well for creating low-level quests that you can use to start a game. But in addition to that, there's just plenty of other videos on how to do this. I think that Matt Colville has a great video on running your first dungeon or your first adventure, starting your game with the goblins kidnapping the blacksmith's daughter. I did exactly that when I started my game, and so I don't really feel like I have anything to say on this topic. I feel like there's enough resources available that you guys can create your own first level adventure to start your party out on. Later on in the series, I want to create a dungeon, like a proper dungeon with you guys, but that's not this episode, so we're going to move right along. The next thing, after you've got your adventure planned out and you figured out how you're taking your notes, you need to figure out some maps. You need to draw up some maps for your players. Players love maps, and I would recommend, when you're just starting your game, it may seem like a bit, but I would recommend 4 maps. Yes, 4 maps. I would recommend 1 continental map, and if you have a large continent with many different nations, like most fantasy games have these days, I would then recommend a regional map or a kingdom map, a map specific to their location, whichever nation that they are currently in. And then I would recommend that on top of that, for your 3rd map, you have a local map. A map depicting the city that they're in, or the local region with hills, mountains, oceans, geological features, anything that would catch their eyes or traveling by, that sort of thing. Also, maybe just your city map as well. Your local map can be your city map, a basic city map. And you don't have to have it every single building down. A city map doesn't even have to be a physical map. It can just be a list of businesses and locations and stuff. And then maybe you mention where in the city they are. In your notes when you're doing that. But it doesn't have to even be a physical map. And then for your 4th map, your final map, and you might not even need this one, but I think it's always good to be prepared. You're starting, building, room, etc. However you're starting your game, you want to have a map for wherever that's at. And we're going to talk about how you might want to open your game too. There's different ways of doing it. There's guilds. You can have your players associated through a guild. And this goes back to the player associations I mentioned earlier in the video. You could have a dramatic opening. If your players already know each other and they've already known each other for some time, maybe it's a one-off, or it's maybe you're continuing a campaign that has taken a break and is now resuming. Maybe you want to open it during a dramatic event or something, a dramatic encounter, something like a big fight or something. Think like Guardians of the Galaxy 2, how it opens when they're fighting off this giant pan-dimensional space beast or whatever it was. But yeah, there's a dramatic open that you could use. And then, of course, there's the ever tried and true tavern. You know, people will say not to use a tavern. People will say, why would you want to use a tavern? Some people will tell you that I only use taverns. That's, you know, it's up to you if you want to use a tavern or not. I think they're perfectly fine, but again, it goes back to the player associations. If you're going to start in a tavern, especially these days, you want to make sure that your players know each other. At least a few of them know each other before you start the game. That way, they have a reason to talk with each other in the tavern. They have a reason to be hanging out with each other and bothering with each other, really. Because otherwise, you know, a lot of players these days, they're so into the role-playing that if they don't think there's a really good, like, well, why would I go over and talk to them? I have no reason to. I'm not associated with them. And so you have to then come up with reasons to try to, like, get them to interact with each other when they just want to sit down and have a drink. Those are some of the problems. Back in the day, you know, the players were all about it. You know, they knew that they were playing the game so that they could go raid a dungeon or loot a dungeon for some sweet loots, some cool treasure that they wouldn't find anywhere else. Nowadays, players are all about the role playing. It seems, or more players are about the role playing, and that means that they aren't metagaming nearly as much, or they aren't metagaming in the correct situations. But that's the topic for another video as well. Alright, so you've got an adventure, and you've got some maps ready to go, and hopefully you have everything else figured out as well, and your players know what they're doing. Now you need to get to building some NPCs for your game, and this shouldn't be too hard, actually. This should be pretty easy. You shouldn't really need too many, even no matter what kind of game you're running, sandbox or railroad, you shouldn't really need too many, especially for this first session. If you're starting in a tavern, alright, you know, we'll just assume that you're starting in a tavern because a lot of people like it. It's very classic. So, we're going to say we're starting in a tavern. You need at least 2 names, maybe 3 names, okay? One for the barkeep, and maybe you have 2 barmaids that you want to give a name for. So a male name and a female name, maybe 2 females, or maybe you have a waiter or something, and there's a male serving staff. So, 3 names there. Now you want to come up with some names for your quest. Alright, you need at least 3 names for that as well. There's going to be a quest giver, there's going to be the quest target, and then there's going to be the antagonist for the quest. So, the quest giver, if we're going back to our Matt Colville starter dungeon, is the blacksmith. The local blacksmith kicks open the door, and this is how you bring your players together if they weren't already together before, maybe, like I did with my players. So, blacksmith charges in, says that the goblins have kidnapped his daughter. There you go. There's the quest giver, the blacksmith. His goblins are the antagonists who have taken his daughter, who is the target of the quest, essentially. So, only a few names that you need there, really. And you don't even have to name them. My players didn't even ask the blacksmith's name at first. They didn't even ask the barkeep's name at first. I don't think they have yet, actually. But anyway, now you need just a few more random names. I would say generally 6 to 10 random names. I like to do like 10 to 12, but if you're, you know, kind of crunched for time, you probably don't need that many. I just like to have a lot of variety to choose from, you know. Then I have an option to be like, he doesn't sound quite like a this, like a Kendall. He sounds more like a Kendrick or like, you know, like a Thomas or something like that. Come up with 6 to 10 random names and just keep those on the side of your sheet, on your game notes. Kind of like I saw in my example that I had there, my sandbox notes. And this is going to be very, very useful. You just have to make sure that you track any of the names that you use off of that random list. If you pick one of those names and begin generating a character for it, maybe underline it really quickly, so that when you're taking your notes later, you can recount who that person was exactly. Like, what was their job? Why were the players speaking to them? What did they say to the players? That sort of thing. It'll help you immensely with your recall, and it'll be good for your players, too, especially if you have really thorough players, like really good note takers. they will be like, hey, we want to speak to Brendel again, and you're like, wait, shit, who's Brendel again? Flip. Oh yeah, Brendel. Yeah, of course I know who that is. You don't want to be caught in that position. No GM wants to be in that position. So make a little list of those names that you've used too, maybe on a separate document, maybe, and try to keep it with your game notes so that you have it quick at hand. And this, like I said, this is useful for railroad games as well. This is not just a sandbox game. It can be very beneficial for railroad games. You want to give your players the freedom to explore their environment in a railroad game. That's essential. If the players don't feel like they have at least some control over the game, then they are not going to want to play. You have to give them room to explore the world and stuff, and random names can really help with that. So, it also helps because it helps you not get bogged down in the minutia, the tiny little details of the story that you're creating and weaving, pretty much on the fly. So it's very handy to just be able to quickly pick out a name and then make a note or underline it or star it or highlight it, however you need to, just to track it, so that later you know who they are and what they were doing. I also want to quickly note that you really don't need to spend a lot of time creating voices or characters for all of these NPCs, especially if you've got a bit of experience under your belt as a game master. It should be pretty easy for you to just create some random voices and personas or personalities on the fly. Or, maybe you write down some personality notes while you're creating some names for the static NPCs, the barkeep, the quest giver, the target, that sort of thing. That could be useful in your note taking as well. It can help you come up with a character much easier than it would otherwise be. Alright, and you guys should be set now. You should have everything you need to get your adventure off to a start. Get it rolling. I'm going to do some more videos in the future. I'm going to do a dungeon video. I mentioned that earlier. I noticed there are not a lot of really good dungeon building tutorials, or hardly any really online, just a lot of notes and stuff on how to do it. And so I thought I might take you through an example of how I build a dungeon, or something like that, a dungeon-like structure. I also want to do a video on railroad games in the future. I have a different definition of railroad maybe than a lot of other people, and I think that they absolutely can work, and they can be incredibly rewarding for everybody involved if done correctly. And so I want to give you some tips on exactly how I do that. They're pretty much they're essentially the same, but they require a bit more finesse and a little more work on your end to make sure that everything goes off without a hitch. I also want to do maybe I might do a metagaming video at some point, a discussion about metagaming, because I see that there's a bit of confusion about metagaming, or a lot of people seem to have conflicting definitions of what metagaming is or what it entails, and a lot of people aren't sure whether it's good or bad. I might not do this video though, because there's actually a lot of really great videos already on YouTube on this topic. I would specifically recommend Matt Colville's video on metagaming, or the D.M.M.C video on metagaming. Both of those are excellent, and there's quite a few others as well. If you look around, you'll find them. My next video will most likely be on stat cards, because like the dungeons, I noticed that a lot of people talk about using stat cards. Everybody touts stat cards, touts stat cards as being, like what you should use for your monster blocks and stuff like that, your random mobs and that sort of thing. And but there's there's not a lot of videos on exactly how to do that, what good layouts are for that. And so I'm going to show you how I lay out my stat cards in that video probably, and explain to you how easy they are to use and how you can store them and quickly access them and that sort of thing. Alright, well that's all I have for this video. Thank you everyone for listening, and I certainly hope I'm going to see you soon.